In this year, I'm going to discuss the concept of bringing karbanos bizman hazeh, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash. The past 2,000 years almost, we're not bringing back with karbanos since we do not have the Beis HaMikdash. However, if we really look carefully into the words of some Gemaras, some Rishonim, some Achreinim, we can see that there's room to say that maybe a possibility to bring karbanos. This is based on the principle that the Kedusha Rishona, the first Kedusha, which was invested into the Har HaBayit, does not leave Kedusha Le'zazim Kema. Now, even though the place of the Beis HaMikdash may still retain its holiness, nevertheless, how can one entertain the possibility of bringing karbanos bizman hazeh if we are all presumed to be tmei meis? We know that since we do not have the paraduma, we all presume to be the tmei meis. So that problem can be avoided by citing the principle of tumahut b'tzibur. That means if we're talking about a communal carbon, such as a tamid, or Korban Pesach, or the Yom Tov offerings, we can bring the karbanos even though we're tmei meis. As long as we have the principle that there's still kedusha in the place of the mizbeach, we can bring it even though we're tmei meis. One of the first source which discusses the concept of bringing karbanos these days is the Kafta B'Ferach. The Kafta B'Ferach brings an exchange between him and one of the Balitoises of Yichim Paris. Now, the Kafta B'Ferach was from the Rishonim, and he went to Eretz Yisrael, and he really was Isaac in a lot of the things which are neged to Eretz Yisrael, such as the exact boundaries of the Shvatim, many of the halachis which pertain only to Eretz Yisrael, and he had an exchange between himself and Rabbi Chilmi Paris, this one of the Baal Tosfos, and Rabbi Chilmi Paris says he wants to go to Yerushalayim to be Makar Korban Pesach. He felt this was the right thing to do. The Kafta B'Ferach wrote that he had his objections to it, but he did not engage Rabbi Chilmi Paris at all in this, and he kept his concerns to himself since he was busy with writing his sefer. He couldn't be bothered with dealing with this. But at any rate, we see that there was such a concept even then. Now the Gemara brings in Masechta Megillah a machlokes regarding if you can bring karbanos bizman hazeh when there's no Beis HaMikdash, and this is dependent upon the principle. If we read the Gemara over there, if kedusha rishona kitcha l'shaita v'kitcha l'asadavi, if kedusha rishona kitcha l'shaita v'lo kitcha l'asadavi, meaning that the kedusha rishona, the first kedusha which Yeshua invested into Eretz Yisrael, Har HaBayit, Yerushalayim, remains even later, even after the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, or not. And according to this, we answer if you could bring karbanos bizman hazeh. So there's such a machlokes in Gemara and Masechta Megillah. The Rambam and the Ravid argue if you could bring karbanos bizman hazeh. The Rambam writes, "Lefichach makrivim karbanos bizman hazeh." Therefore, we're allowed to bring karbanos bizman hazeh. So it's very clearly. And the Ravid argues said, absolutely not. You're not allowed to be makriv karbanos bizman hazeh. There's no way to be makriv karbanos bizman hazeh. Now, if we look at the way the Rishonim explain the Gemara Megillah, we see that the question whether Eretz Yisrael retains its kedusha and the question whether Yerushalayim retains its kedusha do not depend on each other. Meaning to say that one can hold that Eretz Yisrael has kedusha and the place of the Beis HaMikdash is not a kedusha. Meaning that Eretz Yisrael does not have its kedusha for whatever halachis, and the place of the Beis HaMikdash retains its kedusha regarding Karis, regarding Karbanis. And so too we can hold that the Beis HaMikdash does not have kedusha, but the Eretz Yisrael does have kedusha. That means we're able to analyze the Gemaras and say that they're not independent. Taisa says this very clearly over there in Megillah. We're not going to go into exactly how we learn those Gemaras. We're really inside, but for the Shen, that's how it comes out. That means the Rambam holds that the Beis HaMikdash has kedusha, and it's possible to say that Eretz Yisrael does not have kedusha. And the Ravid holds the opposite extreme, that the Beis HaMikdash, the place of the Beis HaMikdash, does not have kedusha. Therefore, you can't bring korbanos. You're not chayav kodesh if you come to the Beis HaMikdash. And it's possible to hold that Eretz Yisrael does have kedusha. They're not. These two machlokes are not dependent on each other. So the Magen Avram brings this machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid, and he paskins that we should be concerned according to the Rambam. What does it mean to be concerned according to the Rambam? The application of this machlokes between the Rambam and the Ravid of whether the place of the Beis HaMikdash retains kedusha. The result of this is a very important question. According to the Rambam, if you go to the place of the Beis HaMikdash, Bizman Azad, you're chayav kodesh, you went to the place of the Beis HaMikdash when you're with Tamim. According to the Ravid, there's no longer kedusha over there. Since there's no longer kedusha over there, if you go over there, you're not chayav kodesh. Could be there's a problem with the Rabbanon, maybe. According to the Ravid, I'm not going to get into that. But there's definitely no chiv midaraisa according to the Ravid nowadays. So this application is regarding Karis. What about the application regarding Korban Pesach? So the Chayre, there's a big application regarding all Korbanis Sibur, that according to the Rambam, that is Kedusha, just like before the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. You could bring Korbanis Bizman Azah, all Korbanis Sibur. We apply the principle of Tum Huta B'Tzibur, and we can bring Korbanis Sibur. Korbanis Yachid, you can't bring Korbanis Yachid because of the problem of Tumah. But all other Korbanis you can bring these days. However, it's not really the case. Why? Because the Rambam paskins that Korbanis Sibur have to come from the Machzah Shekel. And we don't bring Machzah Shekel today. So how, let's say a Korban Talmud, how does a Korban Talmud come a Korban Sibur? You bring it from Machzah Shekel. If you can't bring Machzah Shekel these days, so how do all these Korbanis, the Yom Tov Korbanis, come Korbanis Sibur? So the only Korban Sibur which does not come from Machzah Shekel is a Korban Pesach. So regarding Korban Pesach, there's a serious application of the Rambam that it could be according to the Rambam, you can bring a Korban Pesach, but regarding all the other Korbanis, you can't. Now, since there's a chiv to bring Korban Pesach Bizman Hazeh, seemingly according to the Rambam, what happens if someone finds himself within that radius of the Beis HaMikdash? At the time that there's a chiv to bring the Korban Pesach, which is Yudal B'Nisan after Chatzos, seemingly it's a big problem. You'll be chayav kodesh. Someone has to remove himself from the place of the Beis HaMikdash. So Tzitz Eliezer paskins very interestingly, and he says one does not have to remove himself from the place of the Beis HaMikdash at that time, even though l'chayra there's a day of the Rambam that you're chayav to bring Korban Pesach. And if you're chayav to bring a Korban Pesach and one finds himself in that place, within that radius, within a certain radius, whatever radius the halacha is, one is chayav kodesh. Because he says, according to the Rambam, there's only a possibility that one may be able to bring a Korban Pesach. But to say that there's an obligation, that there's a chiv to bring a Korban Pesach, that's not true. That according to the Rambam, it's impossible that there's a chiv to bring Korban Pesach in a time when there's no actual Beis HaMikdash. That's what the Tzitz Eliezer paskins. The Rebbe writes to Rav Zevin that one should remove himself from the place of the Beis HaMikdash at the time when there's a chiyuv to bring Korban Pesach. That's what he writes. Now, one of the main sources, really the main source who talks about Korbanos Bizman Hazeh is our Tzvi Kalisher. Tzvi Kalisher was a big guy of Tzion. He was a Talmud of the Nesivis and Rabbi Kiva Eger, and he wrote a sefer which is called the Drishas Tzion. And he brings many rayas why one should be able to bring Korbanos Bizman Hazeh. And I'll bring a few of the rayas that he brings. I'm not going to go into every single thing that he says, but he brings a raya from Gemara in Zvachim. That the Gemara says in Zvachim that 3 Nevi'im came up from the Golus in Bavel. And one of the Nevi'im testified that you can bring Korbanos even though there's no Beis HaMikdash. This Gemara was talking about after Churban Bayis Rishon, before the building of the second Beis HaMikdash. So this is the same situation as today, that there's no Beis HaMikdash. Nevertheless, one can bring Korbanos Bizman Shein Bayis. It's also interesting Gemara in Ketzat Tzelem that Ramgil told the servant to roast the Korban Pesach. This Gemara was the Chayda after the Churban HaBayis. You could see from the people who are in the story. However, there are many problems with bringing a Korban Pesach these days. One of the big problems is the big dekuna. In order to bring Korbanos Bizman Hazeh, one would need to determine what's the correct big dekuna. A kohen can't bring a korban with possible big dekuna. Now there's many sveikis. What's the right big dekuna? For example, our gaman, there's a machlokes in the Ram and the Ravid. What's our gaman? Would we paskin like? There's no shulchan aruch to paskin like who? There's the issue of tchelis. What's tchelis? Do we know what tchelis is today? Tzvi Kalish has a huge chiddush about tchelis. He holds that the tchelis of tzitzis and the tchelis of big dekuna are different. That means that the tchelis from tzitzis, one is not, that we're not sure about. But the tchelis of big dekuna just has to be a certain shade of blue, and that won't be an issue, which is a big chiddush on his part to say. That's what he says. We have the problem of kohenim uchzakim. That means in order to bring Korbanos, we can't just have any kohenim. We have to have kohenim uchzakim. That there's a chazaka that in their lineage there was never a psul. None of the kohenim from the previous generations married a mangrusha bechalutza, which would invalidate the future generations. Do we have such kohenim? We don't have such kohenim. So Tzvi Kalish just says that the concept of kohenim uchzakim is dafka din alechatchila, but b'diavad we don't need it. There's also an interesting vart which they say in the name of the brisket of. He brings some at the Sefta in Brachis, the first barak of Brachis, that the Beis HaMikdash has to be a har. And he learns that the Sefta, that if the Beis HaMikdash is not a har, Beis HaMikdash is not a mountain, it's lacking from the very definition of the Beis HaMikdash, and you cannot bring Korbanos over there. Now everyone knows that when we go up to the Kaisel, we're not going up, we're going down. Now the Pasuk says, "V'kam to Ba'alisa l'makim hazeh." One goes up to the Beis HaMikdash. The Beis HaMikdash was on a mountain. What happened to that Pasuk? How come we're going down to the mountain? The reason is because the Romans, Yimach Shemam, and the great Rishis, when they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they didn't just destroy the Beis HaMikdash, they went and they lowered the Beis HaMikdash. They made it lower to degrade the Beis HaMikdash. So when the Romans degraded the Beis HaMikdash by lowering it, according to what they say over the name of the brisket of, the Beis HaMikdash is now lacking the very definition of the Beis HaMikdash in order to bring Korbanos, and that would that would be ma'akiv, that would hold back the Yidden for bringing a korban until that problem is rectified. Another problem is that the Mizbeach has to be ischanech with a Talmud Shel Shachar, and that's what the Rambam says, and we don't have, we can't bring a Talmud Shel Shachar because it can't come from the Korban Sibur, like we explained before. So these are only part of the issues. There's really a lot more Shakla B'taya that we can discuss. One of the big chidushim of the Kalisha is that when you bring the Korban Mizman Hazeh, when you bring the Korban Pesach Mizman Hazeh, you have to make a Tanai. You have to make a condition. What kind of condition do you make? That you bring a condition like this. If the halacha is like the Rambam, that the place of the Beis HaMikdash has Kedusha, then we're bringing it on the Mokim HaMizbeach. You're bringing it as a korban on the Mokim HaMizbeach. And if we pass it like the Ravid, then we're bringing it as a korban on a boma. That means these days that we do not have the place of the Beis HaMikdash, which has holiness according to the Shita of the Ravid, there's Bamis again. The halacha is when there's the place of the Beis HaMikdash, Nasa Bamis, you're not allowed to make a Bamis, it's Aveda to make a Bamis. But when there's no Beis HaMikdash, then you're allowed to make Bamis. So he holds that we make a Tanai that place of the Beis HaMikdash comes a Bama if there's no Beis HaMikdash, because then you're allowed to make a Bama. So you make such a Tanai. However, we can ask questions on this Chiddush. Because what is this korban? If it's a korban sibur, because you want it to be a korban sibur like this, you can bring a betuma, that you can't bring it on a bama, because you can only bring korbanis yachid be bama. And if it's a korban yachid, you can't bring it on the place of the mizbeach because it's kedusha. So there's a big kasha on this chiddush of the kalash. So we could answer the chayre. They would have to make another tanai. That according to the Rambam, we're going to have to say that means we're going to have to say that if it's we pass him like the Rambam, then it's a korban sibur. And if we pass him like the Ravid, then it's a korban yachid. That means if we pass him according to the Rambam, we're going to have to say two things. Number one, this place is Mokim HaMikdash. It's Mokim HaMikdash, you're bringing a korban. Which type of korban are you bringing? It's a korban sibur. That means we're saying it's only a korban sibur if we pass it according to the Rambam. That means we don't know what this korban is. If we pass it like the Ravid, and there's no Mokim HaMikdash, so we're going to say that this place is a bama. And if this place is a bama, then which type of korban is this? This korban is a korban yachid, because you can only be makriv korbanis yachid on a bama. So we're going to have to make up a double mimanushach over here. So right now we're not sure what this place is. Is it Makom HaMikdash? We don't know if we're bringing the korban on Makom HaMikdash. We don't know if we're bringing it on a bama. We don't know if this korban is a korban siba. We don't know if it's a korban yachid. We're saying we're not sure. Based on who we paskin like, we're going to determine. It should be determined if it's which kind of korban this is, which is a very big chiddush. Now we can see from what we discussed that there is room to say that there's a possibility to bring korbanis, at least a Korban Pesach these days. However, we can also see that there are many shilas, many sveikis, many questions that we can dingen if you could bring a Korban Pesach these days. According to this, we can understand what the Rebbe told Rav Zevin, that one should be concerned, according to the Rambam, and one should remove himself before the time that there is a chiyuv to bring a Korban Pesach, so as not to violate the Isser of the Issacharists by being in that place. But we could also understand why the Rebbe didn't say, oh, there's a chiyuv to bring a korban, because it's not so clear that we have the ability to bring the korban, that we have the proper biktikuna, for example. To be sure, the Rebbe was of the opinion that after it became clear that Israel would not retain sovereignty over the Makom HaMikdash, and the Israelis, they gave it back to the Arabs, and they let them do what they want over there. It's not, we don't have sovereignty, we don't have full sovereignty over there. There was an opinion that there's no union to remove oneself from the place of the Beis HaMikdash. One lives within that place in that time, since it's impossible to bring a korban. It's not like we're able to bring a korban, we're not bringing a korban, therefore we're chayv kares. Anyways, we should be zoicha that very soon we should be able to bring all the korbanos, say korbanos yachid, say korbanos sibur, the Mashiach Tzidkenu, B'mheira B'yameinu, mamash.